quilty friend, it's Carolina Moore, your favorite sewing and quilting YouTuber, and whether you're watching this on December 13th or you're watching this many days after, that's totally fine. Welcome to putting together all of your mini quilt advent blocks. I'm so happy you're here. And if you're watching this on the 13th but you don't have all your blocks put together yet, that's totally fine. Welcome. I'm glad you're here to hang out. If you're new to the Mini Quilt Advent and you don't know anything about it, go down to the links below, see if there's still kits available, and see if you can join in. It is never too late to join until we run out of kits. And then if you don't have a kit, I'm sorry, we don't make more. All right, friends, let's get right into our video. Now before we hop into today's video, you may want to square up your quilt blocks. You may have gotten the 6.5 inch square Creative Grids ruler to square up your blocks, or you may have a ruler already. Now when squaring up blocks, the general rule is you need a ruler that's at least as big as the blocks that you're squaring up. So this 6.5 by 6.5 will work because our blocks are 6.5 by 4.5 inches unfinished. So they finish at 6 by 4, but unfinished. They're 6.5 by 4.5, so we need a ruler that's at least 6.5 by 4.5. If you have an 8.5 by 8.5 inch square ruler, that's definitely bigger. You can use that. You don't need to buy every single size square up ruler to be able to square up your quilt blocks. Any size bigger than the blocks that you are making will work absolutely fine. Now this video is going to be long enough already, so I don't want to go through all the details of squaring up because I also have a video all on squaring up. I'll link that down in the description. You can also click here if you want to go watch the video on how to square up quilt blocks. It has all the tips and tricks that you ever wanted and some that you never knew that you wanted on squaring up quilt blocks. So you can watch that there, and we can hop right into putting our quilt together. All right, we've made all our blocks and I've put them on my design wall here, and I've put a little extra space between to help with the layout of all the sashing pieces that we're about to cut. Now, if you don't have a design wall, that's totally fine. You can put them on a table, you can put them on a rug. Another thing that I like is I go to the craft store and I get a big canvas, but then I cover it in a scrap piece of batting, and then my pieces will stick to this because this is just foam core or foam insulation covered in batting. So you can do the same thing and make yourself a mini design wall, mini portable design wall with a piece of inexpensive canvas that you get, like a frame. It's not even framed. I don't know. Anyway, one of these canvases from the craft store, and just cover it with batting, and then you have a portable design wall if you want to be able to lay them out and see. Now I'm leaving mine in order 1 through 12, but you don't have to. You can put them in whatever order you want. The one thing that I'd say is watch for any directionality in the fabric. So I want to make sure my barn is right side up, this house is right side up, my cars are right side up, my ornaments are right side up. We did the job of fussy cutting these and having them all right side up. So this is a point where it's so easy to get one flipped and we don't want to flip them. So just make sure they're all directionally correct as we go to put them together. Okay, we saved this fabric from our fat quarter bundle to use as our sashing and our border one. Now technically sashing is the fabric that goes between the blocks, and border one is the first border all the way around. You can add more borders if you like, super simple. But for this one, we're just adding a sashing in border one. Border one is often the same fabric as the sashing because it kind of helps it be more cohesive, but it isn't in all quilts, and that's totally fine. In this quilt, it's fairly traditional. Our sashing and our border one are exactly the same. So I often use the term sashing to mean sashing and border one and not just sashing. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and cut. I have our piece of fabric pressed here and on my cutting mat. And if I line up this straight selvage edge, and you might have a printed selvage edge, that's also totally fine. This is an unprinted selvage edge. And if I line this up, you'll see that it's not exactly square, and that's super normal. We cut these. However, when I starched it, some of the fabrics, the weave of the fabric would have shifted a little bit. And also, generally when we cut things off the bolt, it's not exactly perfect. Usually you either order or get or have a little bit of extra fabric. Not all shops do offer extra fabric because it does cost them money to add extra fabric onto your order. But we have plenty to work with. So I'm cutting off at most a 1/2 inch, at the least a little less than a 1/4 inch, just to square it up. You can cut off the absolute minimum you need just to give yourself a straight edge along one side for us to work from. So now you can either turn your mat or turn your fabric. For right-handed quilters, we cut from the left over, and for left-handed quilters, we cut from the right over. All right, so I'm going to cut 1.5 inch pieces here. So let me turn my ruler so it's actually on the 1.5, and actually put my reading glasses on so I can see what I'm doing. And then at this point, like, you don't need it lined up with the mat really at all. I don't really have it lined up with the mat because we're using the lines on our ruler and cutting 1.5 inches. So we're going to cut this all the way down, and if you ever notice that it's your cut edge gets a little wonky, flip it back over, just square it up again, and then keep cutting your strips. And that little bit of wonkiness can happen if your ruler slips as you're cutting over time. So when our ruler slips, it tends to slip the same every time. So a little bit on the top, a little bit on the top, and then you'll end up having your you'll start seeing your strip kind of curving a bit. So just pay attention to if this still looks straight as you cut, and we're going to keep cutting our 1.5 inch strips all the way down. Now we've cut all of our 1.5 inch pieces, and I know the instructions say to sew them end to end, but we can actually get away with cutting a lot of our pieces without having to sew them together yet. And so I'm going to do that here. It's one of the benefits of watching the video is that you get kind of the cheat codes in the video. The instructions are written the proper way that we put things together, but I like to cheat when I can. So we need a total of 8 4.5 inch segments, and I can get 9 4.5 inch segments out of 3 strips. So I just put 3 strips right on top of each other, and I'm going to go ahead and cut my 4.5 inch segments. And because I don't feel like turning everything because I've already lined everything up on the mat, I'm just going to use the lines on the mat to cut this, and it'll be okay. But 1, 2, 3, 4.5. I'm going to definitely double and triple count because it is so easy to make a counting mistake when cutting and then having a segment that is not big enough and you wonder why. And then you learn that it's because you messed up the cutting, the counting of the cutting. All right, so that's 9. I have 1 extra, and then I have these extra bits of fabric that I can absolutely use to tack onto some of my longer pieces if I need. So I'm going to set those aside. This little selvage end bit I'm going to just toss, and I have all of these sashing pieces. Now I'm going to go ahead and put these on the board so that you can see. Now my candy canes are sideways, and I'm totally fine with that here. And you can decide, do you want the candy canes like one this way and one that way? So like I can flip this one around. Does it matter to you? I don't know that it really matters to me, but you get to put yours together however you like. So now we're going to need our long pieces. We're going to need 5 pieces that are each 20.5 inches long. This is Art Gallery Fabrics, so I should be able to get an entire 20.5 inch segment out of these individual pieces. If you're using a different line of fabric, they might not be a full 20.5 inches. So you might have to sew together, and that's totally fine. I'll show you how in the next step when we sew together for our 2 long border pieces, our border 1 pieces. So I have just enough to do this without sewing. pieces together. If you have a piece that has the decorative selvage edge, you might need to stitch pieces together, and that's also totally okay. Not a big deal. What you would do is you would just sew all the pieces into one long segment and then cut out 20.5 pieces. And the reason you would do one long segment and then cut down your pieces is because then that seam would be at different spots in your sashing and it wouldn't be as noticeable. Whereas if you sewed like one of these small bits to each end, you have your seam in like the same spot and it would be more noticeable in your finished quilt. Okay, so these are my horizontal sashing pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and just add those on here, and also my border one. Now you'll notice that it is not long enough, right? As we put this on the design wall, it's not long enough, and it's not supposed to be, because first of all, you can see my design wall between, and also here, that's a 1/2 inch, and here, that's a 1/2 inch. That's a whole inch in seam allowance that hasn't been accounted for, as well as here. So this is 2 inches in seam allowance. Even if these were all butted up exactly against one another, you'd still be, these would look like they're 2 inches short, and they're not, because we still need to put in our seam allowances, or sew together and account for our seam allowances. We can already start to see this come together. Oh, I love it so much. I did keep my candy canes directional here, but again, you can do whatever you want. And now we need our 2 long pieces. So now we can add these to our design wall. And again, our candy canes are directional. So since I did these candy canes this way, I'll do these outside ones these way. Again, it's going to look short. Of course it looks short because we haven't done any of our seam allowances yet. So that is normal. There we go. So now we get an idea a little bit of what our quilt looks like. It's time to start putting this together, which is super, super simple. Now that we have all our pieces cut, it's time to sew the top together. This is really simple. You just have to do it in order. So we need to sew each of our rows together, and you can sew one row together, and then the next row together, and then the next row together, and then the next row together. I like to do it where I sew these two, these two, these two, these two, and then I add this one on, this one on, this one on, this one on, and then this and this and this. So I get to chain piece my rows that way, and I feel like that's faster, but you do whatever way works for you. When your rows are together, you're going to press everything towards your sashing. And the reason we press towards the sashing is because there are seams in all of our blocks, and so if we press towards the block, we have the potential to push seam onto seam, and that creates bulk. In these little sashing pieces, there are no seams at all, so pressing towards the sashing guarantees we won't be pressing seam onto seam. That'll change here on our border one, but that's okay. All right, so we're going to press towards the sashing, make all of our rows, and then we're going to sew our rows together basically the same way, where we sew this border one outside to this top row, and then sew this one on, and then this one, and then this, and this, as we keep going all the way down. Now you can go all the way through. I find that you end up with a really bulky thing about halfway through. So instead, I like to sew top sashing, top, top, top. So I'm just sewing them into pairs, and then I can start sewing the pairs together and then add that bottom piece of border one or sashing. And that way I don't have something as bulky until the very, very end. And that makes it a little bit more easy to manage. And then once we've done that, again, we're going to press towards our sashing, and then we just add on our last 2 border strips and we press towards our borders. Simple enough, right? Okay, let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to go pretty quick, and if you have any questions, leave those in the comments, and I'll pop in also with any tips as I'm sewing so that you can see what this all looks like. Alright, I went ahead and did my sashing onto the first block, and then I'm just adding the sashing onto the second block. It's easy enough to add sashing, and then again, I don't have as bulky of a piece to run through my sewing machine. Less bulk is nice. Now, a question that I often get is in regards to pinning, and I'm not a big pinner. Leave the pinning to Pinterest, I guess. And so you won't be seeing a lot of pins in general when I make videos. I'm just not a big fan of using pins. But if you like to pin and you want to pin, absolutely do. Pin away. Once I have all of these all chained, so this would be the first 8 blocks, I'm going to put them all back. If you're worried about this step, you can always take a photo before you move on to start sewing things together so that you don't lose where you had everything laid out. Also, you'll notice I didn't press any of these yet. You don't need to press, as we talked about before, until you have a seam going across. And since all the seams I'm doing right now are vertical seams, I don't need to press any of this until I'm going to go do one of these horizontal seams. So I'm going to hold off on my pressing because I find it easier to just press all at once rather than pressing in pieces. However, if you're someone who says, nope, I want to press before I put it back up on the design, go ahead and press right before you put it back on the design wall. Totally fine. Right, so now all my blocks that can have a sashing piece on them do, so I can start sewing these together into longer rows. It's really just 2 more seams on each of these to get the whole rows together. Instead of laying them all back up, I'm just grabbing the very last one on the end of the row, or of my, I guess, chain for chain piecing, and adding the last block onto that one. It should be pretty obvious where it goes, and hopefully I won't make a mistake, but if I do make a mistake, it won't be the first time I've used a seam ripper. Seam ripper and I are good friends. In fact, I'm probably due for a new seam ripper because my seam ripper gets dull. Some good use. So mistakes happen. It's okay. That's what a seam ripper is for. But I think this will be okay, and I'll just be able to just grab the last one off the end and then sew them together, and then it'll be time to press our rows. Alright, all my rows have been sewn, and I'm going to leave them here on the back of my machine, so chained together still, so it's very easy for me to know where they go back on the design wall. However, if they end up in a different spot on the design wall and I don't notice, no one will know that they were supposed to be someplace else, except maybe you, which feel free to mention in the comments if I manage to accidentally shift the spot of one of these blocks, because I don't think I'll notice. I think it'll be fine. So as I mentioned before, we are pressing these towards the sashing. So because I'm right-handed, I tend to press from right to left. So I do the one side and then I flip the row and then I do the other side, and I just find that easier for pressing these kind of sashing seams. And then once I've pressed from the back, I do like to give everything a good press from the front as well, just to keep it as flat as possible. Now that it's pressed, we can put it back in its spot, and if we've done everything right, then this row should be the same length as this 20.5-inch strip, and it is, so yay. If not, we'll talk about ways that we can ease it in if needed. But we're going to go ahead and press our other 3 rows and add those up here so that we can talk about putting all these rows together. All right, if you haven't been doing it as you've been putting your blocks up, now is the time. Double check that all of your blocks are right side up, because now it's an easy 1 or 2 seams to rip to put them right side up, and later it's going to be a whole ordeal to try to get them back to right side up. So this is the time, double check that they're right side up. You want to check this as many times as you can think of during the process, because it is so easy for something to flip at this point and for you to not see it until it's fully quilted or even quilted and bound. And I've been there. So, okay. And there's ways to correct these kinds of mistakes. There's ways that you can fix things. There's always ways to fix things, but it's always better if you don't have the mistake to begin with. So speaking of fixing things, we're going to now put our top and bottom border one as well as our sashing pieces on, and what you do if they are not the same size. So we're going to grab our first sashing / border one piece in our first row, and I'm going to show you the method for pinning these. Yes, I said I don't use a lot of pins. Borders, sashings, long strips like that are when I do use pins. So we're going to grab some pins, and I'm going to show you how to pin this to ease it together to keep it as smooth as possible. We have our row one and our sashing piece, which is really our border one piece, but that's fine. And we want to make sure that they line up perfectly. So what we want to do is find the middle of our row, which is pretty easy. It's this point right here. And then the middle of our sashing piece, which is easy. You're going to fold it in half and give it a little press. And this will iron out later. We're just finger creasing this, but that gives us a middle. So then what we do, once we know the middle of both, is we take one end, line it up, and pin. And then we take the other end. Now I like to pin vertically, or I guess perpendicular to the seam here. And the reason I do that is because if you pin this way, you can shift your fabrics. And the whole point here is trying to get it to line up perfect. So this keeps the fabrics from shifting left, right. Now we find where we did that finger crease, and we line it up with our middle point right here. And we add a pin there. Now, if it wasn't as obvious what the midpoint was on our center block, we could have folded this row in half and that way found the middle as well. Now I want to pin between these two pins, and I see that the sashing piece or border piece has a little more fabric in it than my row. And so I'm going to wrap this around my finger with the sashing on the outside, because that will, it's kind of like when race cars go around a curve, the inside of the curve has less distance and the outside of the curve has more. So wrapping around the curve smooths that out a little bit, and then I can kind of find the middle-ish, and this doesn't need to be the exact middle, and add a pin there. And then on this one, it looks like the block actually has a little more, so I'm going to do the other way around, do the sashing on the inside and the block on the outside, find the middle-ish, and pin. And if you want to add more pins, you can. These pins are less than 6 inches apart, so they are perfectly close. Now we're going to take this over to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew, and we want to ease this in. So easing, it does include a little bit of stretching the fabric, just a touch. So I'm going to take these and smooth it, and I find that sometimes, again, taking fingers, kind of wrapping it around to help it smooth in can be easier. And before I get to a pin, I do pull out my pins. I know that there's some folks who will just run over their pins. If that's you, I'm not going to chastise you. You do you. But I have had times where I've smashed right through that pin, jammed up my needle, gotten the pin jammed up inside the inner workings of my machine, and that's just not worth it over just quickly pulling a pin. That is going to have to get pulled out eventually anyway. So whether I pull it out now or pull it out later, it's going to take the same amount of time. It's just if I do it before the potential of it hitting my needle, I've saved myself the potential of some really big heartache. So I'm not really pulling, stretching, just kind of easing everything in. and now it's perfectly on there. I could go ahead and press it if I wanted, but again, I don't need to press any of these seams until I go do my seams that are perpendicular to it. So I'm just going to put it back. I'm going to sew this one, sew this one, and sew this one the same way. So I'll sew all of these sashing pieces to the rows that are right below it, and then I'll be able to sew these two together and these two together, then add on this bottom border, and then sew the whole thing together. So it's pretty simple, basically the same thing we did with our rows, except now our rows are, instead of putting our rows into rows, we're putting our rows together to make the center and top and bottom borders of our little quilt top. So I'll go ahead and keep sewing these together. So that I don't have to add this one little piece at the end, I'm going to go ahead and add it now. It doesn't really matter which order you sew everything in, as long as they're all in the right spot when you're done. In terms of, you know, if you sew these two together and then these two together, or these two and then that one, as long as they're all in the right order, once they're sewn together, it doesn't matter what order you sew them in as you go. I don't know if that made any sense. Now, as we're adding these together, it's the same thing of easing things in as needed, and it's the same process. If your rows and your sashing aren't exactly the same, you can pin, or you can, there's methods without pinning, but pinning really is, especially for beginners, the most accurate. I like to take the two pieces and then line them up. I have a couple stitches underneath the needle already, and then see how close they line up. Grab the middle and ease as I go, and that prevents pinning, but pinning will be the most accurate and especially easy for beginners when you're putting all these pieces together. And while I love chain piecing, I am stopping, cutting, and then putting things back just because I'm so nervous that I'm going to mix up these rows as I go, and give it a pin there so that hopefully it doesn't fall off my design wall, because as you get more seams, and I haven't pressed all of that yet, it's more likely to fall off. So, all right, 2 more seams, and then the center of this top is already together. Now I've just been showing you how to put this all together, but if you're someone who really likes all of your sashing pieces to super line up as you go, let me show you how you do that. And what we're going to do is we're going to press. So if you want your sashing pieces to super line up as you go, you want to press after adding each sashing strip. So let me go ahead and get these pressed. Okay, if you want these vertical sashings to line up as exactly as possible, here's the technique for doing that. What you want to do is you want to take your ruler, and this can be the square up ruler that we used before, that's totally fine, and you want to line it up with this seam line here, and then make a mark right in your seam allowance. And then we're going to do the same right here on the other side. Make a mark right in your seam allowance. And you want this to be as thin a little mark as possible. That big one is a little bit thick. So because a seam it's just a hair, right? The seam itself is like a hair thick. So the thicker this line, the less accurate it could possibly be, but not a huge deal, because you're not really going, like, it's going to be a little bit difficult to tell if things aren't exactly lined up. Some of mine are not exactly lined up. This one's a little more obvious. This one not as obvious. And I can choose if I want to go back and fix this later, or I can leave it. So these lines here are basically now extensions of our sashing line. If you wanted, you could draw this all the way across, but I find that excessive. Also, a lot of people use friction pens to mark, which is fine in a seam allowance, but it doesn't disappear. It looks like it disappears with heat. It actually turns a waxy white, and if it's cold, like in the winter time, it can actually come back. So that's why I only mark in the seam allowance, just to be safe. Now I can take my piece and I line up this seam line here with that line that I made, and I pin. And I'm going to do this at every single one of those lines. And you can do that with any size quilt where you have sashings, like window pane style sashings like on this. Even if there's a lot more blocks, you can do this at every single intersection of your window pane sashing. Another technique is to have cornerstones, and that way you've got the cornerstones to line up. But here we're basically kind of drawing in our sashing cornerstones. And if you don't know what a cornerstone would be a square of a different fabric in each of these spots. But that requires a lot more piecing to be able to make that happen. So you can, but it's a lot more piecing. And this is basically, you get that accuracy of having cornerstones without having to do all the sewing of cornerstones. So now we can go ahead and bring this to the sewing machine and sew it together. And here we want to be really careful about when we pull those pins, because we don't want anything to shift after pulling those pins. And now, once we press, we should see that everything will line up exactly perfectly in those spots. All right, the entire center is done. It's just 2 seams away. We need to do our 2 vertical borders, and it's the same process that we've done with our horizontal borders. There's nothing really to line up, and if you want to ease these in the same way we did the other ones, then that's perfect to make sure that everything is square and lines up when it's all done. So we're just gonna sew these 2 on, super quick and easy, and press them, and then our top is done. All right, we have these last 2 borders on, and even if you have seams, you will press towards the borders, because if you have seams in your borders, there are less seams in the borders than there are in the quilt blocks. So you're still doing less pressing bulk towards bulk if you press towards your borders. So we're gonna press from the back, and then we'll press from the front as well. And then don't go anywhere, because we're gonna talk about next steps. Every single year that I do the Advent, and this is year 4, I learn from the Advent the year before. I get feedback from y'all on what you loved, what you didn't love, and then I watch, and I watch what kind of comments and responses that I get on different things. And I've seen that not everyone gets their quilts finished into finished quilts. So we're going to this year add 2 more videos. So I know today's the 13th, so you'll get a video today. Well, you got this video today on putting everything together. Tomorrow we're going to add a video on quilting it, so that's on the 14th, and then on the 15th I'm going to have a video on binding it. Now if you don't get it quilted tomorrow and you don't get it bound the day after, no big deal, friends. These videos will stay up. So if you said, oh man, I plan on doing this for 12 days and I wasn't planning on doing the quilting and the binding right now, don't worry about it. We'll quilt it and bind it together when you're ready to watch those videos. Or if you just want to watch them in the background and kind of get the information in your head, and you're not ready to do it yet, also totally fine. But tomorrow we're going to have a quilting video, and the day after we're going to have a binding video. So I am going to grab my backing fabric and my batting to get this all quilted. Let's go ahead and hang her up, because she is a fully finished mini quilt for our Mini Quilt Advent. Love, 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 love how this came out. This has been so much fun. I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope that you'll hang out for the next 2 videos, and hopefully finish your quilt into a fully usable mini quilt. Now, you can use this as a table topper. You can use it as decor on a wall. You could finish it into a pillow if you wanted to finish it into a pillow. Gosh, what else? You can, it makes a great doll quilt. For any littles that you know that might like a little doll quilt or a lovey. So there's all different kinds of ways that you can use mini quilts like this, or it can just have been a fun technique skill builder for you as well in the process, and I hope it was. All right, friends, that's it for today. I hope that you really enjoyed this video, and I will see you right here tomorrow when we quilt this quilt up. Bye for now, my friends.